imagine dedicating years, maybe even decades, to building this enormous multi-story family home. We're talking about a structure that, for its time was a real architectural marvel. And then, like clockwork, 60 to 80 years later, the whole community gathers. Not to celebrate, though. No, they gather to burn that house and every other house in the village right down to the ground. Intentionally.
Yeah, it really does sound like madness, doesn't it? Or maybe some kind of profound cultural sacrifice. But the archaeological evidence, it strongly suggests this was the actual routine practice of the Cucuteni-Trypillia culture.
Okay, let's really dig into this. This is quite the mystery. We're doing a deep dive today into one of the most, enigmatic practices of ancient Europe. These people we're talking about, they existed between 5500 and 2750 BC, so a long time ago. Across what's now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, they aren't, household names like the ancient Egyptians maybe, but they're incredibly significant, potentially the oldest known large society in Europe. A foundational civilization, really.
Absolutely. And our mission today is to move past those initial assumptions. It was just accidents or warfare causing these fires.
Yeah.
We need to look at the archaeological data, the stuff that shows these were deliberate, synchronized arsons happening on this really strict, predictable cycle. And when you grasp the immense scale, the complexity of the structures they were just destroying, the mystery of why they kept doing this becomes even more compelling, exponentially so.
Right, exactly. And to really feel the weight of that destruction, you first have to appreciate the sophistication of what they were building. These were definitely not primitives living in temporary huts or something.
Not at all. Not even close. They were located between the Carpathian Mountains and the Dnieper and Dniester rivers.
Yeah.
They had advanced agriculture, cultivating wheat, barley, legumes. Technologically, they were expert potters, building these huge kilns for colorful clay objects, figurines, and they'd mastered using copper too, for jewelry, axes, tools.
Tools they definitely needed for their building projects, and this is a key nugget for you to hold on to today. Their buildings were just gargantuan. They'd build these reinforced wooden frameworks, right? And then plaster them really heavily with dried clay.
And size-wise, we're talking about some of the largest buildings anywhere in the world at that time. These structures, they often had multiple stories. And the total surfaces could reach up to 7,534 square feet.
Wow. Okay, that gives you a real sense of the scale. To put that in modern terms, that's almost the size of 2 regulation basketball courts.
Yeah.
These were essentially multi-family homes or maybe big communal halls, and these weren't small scattered settlements either. We're talking meticulously planned mega villages.
So you have this thriving, really architecturally advanced society. And the enduring puzzle for archaeologists isn't really how they built them, it's their peculiar state of preservation. Or maybe their state of systemic ruin. Time after time, their carefully planned settlements seem to have been just burned to the ground. On that strict 60 to 80 year cycle you mentioned, building these massive things just to systematically destroy them, it's something else.
And this brings us to the formal term for this whole phenomenon, because it was regional, right? Not just the Cucuteni-Trypillia. What do archaeologists actually call this fiery legacy?
It's called the burned house horizon. That phrase was coined by the British-American archaeologist Ruth Tringham. And what's really fascinating here is that this practice, this repeated house burning, it isn't isolated. It wasn't just happening in Romania and Ukraine. It covers large parts of Neolithic, Central, and Eastern Europe. You see it with cultures like the Kris, Starcevo, Dudeti, the Vinčur, across Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Hungary.
So not just a quirky habit of one group. It was a widespread Neolithic thing across the Balkans, which just makes the mystery even bigger, doesn't it? Now, initially, the common sense explanations probably made sense. These prehistoric homes, they were packed full of flammable stuff, textiles, stored grains, wood, obviously. So why wouldn't archaeologists first assume the fires were just accidental? Lightning strikes, maybe enemy attacks?
That's always the starting point naturally. Accidents happen, warfare happens. But when you really examine the evidence across multiple sites spanning centuries, the destruction is just far too consistent. It's too geographically controlled to just be random bad luck or, constant warfare wiping everyone out again and again. Later analysis, looking really closely at the ash patterns, how the fires actually started and burned, it points overwhelmingly toward controlled, deliberate destruction. This looks much more like a scheduled, maybe even ritualistic practice, not just a series of unfortunate events.
Okay, so once we start ruling out routine misfortune, that really opens the door to the why, doesn't it? Let's explore those competing theories. Maybe start with the symbolic, the cultural explanations.
Right. The symbolic theories basically suggest the destruction serves some kind of critical social or spiritual purpose. You have, for instance, the Serbian archaeologist Mirjana Stevanović. She argued pretty persuasively that the burnings were deliberate and most likely for reasons of a symbolic nature, maybe marking the end of an era for a family or the community. Then there's the pioneering scholar Vikenty Kufojka. He believed the houses were burned when key inhabitants died, essentially turning the structure into a massive home of the dead, kind of huge funeral pyre for a whole family line or generation.
A home for the dead. That's a powerful image. And Ruth Tringham, the archaeologist who coined the term burned house horizon, she also focused on the cultural significance, right? Didn't she suggest it could be tied to things like social cleansing or maybe reinforcing collective memory in these tight communities? I remember reading about her using this fictional but sort of plausible anecdote about a Vinica woman feeling satisfaction watching an abusive family stuff go up in smoke.
Exactly. That anecdote, even though fictional, really hits home the potential for this act to be deeply tied to complex social dynamics, social contracts, hierarchy, dealing with trauma maybe. Imagine living in a small, close-knit village built on this generational cycle, watching your own home or your neighbor's home be purposefully incinerated. That would be a massive communal event. It could simultaneously punish, purify, maybe unify the entire settlement in some way we don't fully grasp.
Okay, so powerful symbolic potential. But then there were the pragmatic theories, which are just as fascinating. They focus less on ritual, more on, well, utility. Like the Russian archaeologist Evgeny Yuryevich Kuchevsky. He proposed the fire wasn't actually destructive at all, that it was structurally reinforcing. How does that work?
Yeah, and this is where their advanced construction techniques really come back into play. Remember all that, Clay? The idea is if they used enough fuel and carefully controlled the burn, the intense heat, maybe over 1,000 degrees Celsius, it would essentially act like a giant kiln. It would fire the dried clay walls, hardening them into a permanent, very durable ceramic surface, like turning the lower part of the house into pottery. They might have been, in effect, accidentally or maybe purposefully turning the structure into this giant unintentional oven. Plus, the intense heat and smoke would also have effectively fumigated and sterilized the living space, got rid of pests, diseases, maybe preparing the site for the next phase.
That actually seems weirdly plausible, a structural benefit. But hang on, if the heat hardened the walls and sterilized everything, why not just, patch the roof, clean up, and keep living there for another 60 years? Why go through the huge effort of tearing down and rebuilding the whole village, cycle after cycle?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it leads to maybe the simplest, most recent pragmatic idea, urban renewal. Plain and simple. The structures were burned down primarily to clear and level the site completely, make a totally clean slate for brand new, maybe even better buildings. Given how massive some of these settlements became, maybe maintaining a planned, regular turnover was just the most logical, though incredibly resource-intensive, method of city planning they had.
So whether it's structural reinforcement, ritual cleansing, or just large-scale urban planning, the idea of intentionally lighting up a, 7,000 square foot house still sounds pretty outlandish. Until you test it, I guess, which archaeologists actually did. They committed arson for science.
They absolutely did, multiple times, in different ways. One initial way was just looking even closer at the actual burn sites. Like in 2022, a Hungarian team analyzed soil and plant matter at a site called Sászalombattó-Földvár. They found evidence that for 2 out of the 3 known burning events there, the fires appeared to have been started intentionally. So confirmation's the site level.
Okay, but the best tests involved actually setting buildings on fire, right?
Yeah.
I heard about one back in 1977. Archaeologists Arthur Bankoff and Frederick Winter bought an old, dilapidated house in Serbia, one built with similar methods, and just lit it up.
That's right. A landmark experiment, really.
Right.
And it was critical. They found that, yes, the wooden roof got completely destroyed, obviously, but the thick clay-plastered walls, they remained surprisingly intact, just like the reinforcement theory suggested. But they also noted something else really crucial. It took an enormous controlled amount of fuel just to get the structure to burn thoroughly and reach high temperatures. This strongly suggested the ancient burnings weren't just accidental campfires gone wrong. These were huge planned investments of fuel and effort.
Okay, but here's where it gets really specific, right? In 2018, a Ukrainian and British team went even further. They didn't just buy an old house, they built 2 historically accurate Cucuteni-Trypillia structures totally from scratch, just to study how they burned.
Yes, that was an amazing project. And the results. They confirmed the feasibility and the control. The walls, again, largely remained intact, showing the reinforcement idea was physically possible. But maybe more importantly, they placed clay pots and figurines inside the structures before burning them. And those artifacts remained virtually unscathed. This suggested the fire was likely a fast, controlled blast of intense heat, focused on the structure itself rather than a slow, all-consuming, destructive fire. And crucially, neither fire spread. Not to the other building, not to the surrounding area. It showed the practice could be safe, controllable, and definitely planned.
Okay, so safe, controllable, maybe even structurally beneficial. But even if it was safe, let's talk about the sheer logistical feat required to actually pull this off every few decades. Those modern experiments, they must have revealed some mind-boggling requirements, right? Just to reach the temperatures they found evidence for in the ground.
Oh, it's staggering. Absolutely staggering when you crunch the numbers. Just for a single one-story building, they estimated heating over 130 trees worth of firewood, specifically gathered and prepared for the burn. Now, for a two-story building, and remember, many of these massive Cucuteni-Trypillia structures were 2 stories that number jumps. You're looking at around 250 trees per house.
250 trees for one house. So what does that calculation tell us about the scale of sacrifice that's involved for a whole village?
Well, let's extrapolate. If you take a typical large settlement, let's say it has 100 houses burning either simultaneously or in a very tight cycle, which seems likely for these larger sites. That community would have needed to harvest wood from an estimated 3.8 square miles of forest, just for one burning cycle. That, right there, is the so what? The sheer scale of the undertaking.
Wow. 3.8 square miles of forest cleared every 60 to 80 years. The amount of planning, the resources, the sheer human effort required. It doesn't just rule out war or wildfires as the main cause, does it? It shines this huge light on the incredibly advanced logistical capabilities these cultures must have had. This wasn't some casual decision made on a whim. This was an enormous multi-generational commitment.
Exactly. That commitment to the 60 to 80-year burn cycle, it must have been woven right into the fabric of their lives. It would have dictated their resource management, maybe their entire cultural calendar. Think about organizing that kind of labor and resource gathering. They were dedicating truly massive resources, not just to building and maintaining their homes, but to this ritualistic, scheduled destruction and immediate rebuilding. It's unlike almost anything else we know.
So we've journeyed from appreciating the really advanced architecture of the Cucuteni-Trypillia to looking at the definitive evidence that proves this repeated, controlled arson was absolutely intentional. We've explored those complex cultural theories, from social cleansing to funeral rites, and the pragmatic evidence pointing towards structural reinforcement or maybe even just large-scale urban renewal.
But that lingering question, the one that really stands out when you look at those logistics, that 3.8 square miles of forest needed for every single cycle. It really comes down to profound value, doesn't it? This clearly wasn't a mistake. It was a deep societal commitment, maintained for potentially millennia across different cultures. So when you consider that dedication, that staggering cost in resources and effort, sustained across generations, just to keep that 60 to 80-year sacrificial cycle going, what does it tell you about their definition of value, their relationship with permanence versus renewal? And maybe what lessons could we even draw about our own concepts of what's worth preserving and what's worth letting go of? What stands out to you?